Record. So thank you again for joining us. Oh, of course, now I have the wrong screen up. Are you at least able to see my slideshow?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I will need an editor later to be able to help us get this done. I want to thank everyone for bearing with us. I know that most of you had trouble getting in, and we will rectify it before next week's talk, which will be on October 22nd. I'm going to be talking about literary hoaxes. I have to say that my fascination with them really came about in the early 70s when the Autobiography of Howard Hughes came out. I was fascinated by Howard Hughes' story. It was revealed to be a literary fraud that Clifford Irving fabricated. What was supposed to be an authorized autobiography for the reclusive and eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. He actually produced fake letters and called editors from exotic places where he was supposedly interviewing Hughes, managing to fool his publisher, other journalists, and obviously us. As publication years neared, Hughes actually came out of seclusion to say that he had no idea who Irving was. The episode later landed Irving in jail after he pleaded guilty to conspiracy. Later in life, he expressed befuddlement for why it all gotten so out of hand. He said, "I never realized I was committing a crime. I thought of it as a hoax." So the word hoax is of 19th century origin, coming from hocus or hocus pocus, which refers to a conjure or a trick. A hoax is designed not merely to tell a story, but to weave a lie around that story, a lie about its origins, its authenticity, and mostly its authorship. To be truly a hoax, a literary ruse must fool its readers, and in the best cases, fool every one of them, at least for a time. Now, there are other conventional devices that we use that are a little shy of a hoax, the roman à clef, where somebody tells a story that is really true but hides it as fiction. The pseudonym or nom de plume or pen name, where you just take on a different avatar or character. There's also the found journal. Those happen all the time, where somebody wrote a journal and it's published, but it's faked. The ghostwriter, I've been one of those myself. I have had to sign non-disclosure statements. So the books that I worked on, I'm nowhere in the acknowledgements. Now more and more ghostwriters are being at least listed in some kind of acknowledgement. And they exist within a socially sanctioned and implied contract are packed with the readers. So most of those, you understand the inside joke. A real hoax violates those norms and conventions, and its intent is not to be transparent, but really rather deceptive. So literary hoaxes have long been with us, whether it's the African spider Trickster in Nancy, Burr Robert, or the coyotes in Native American mythology. Tricksters have long been with us. Prometheus tricked Zeus and stole fire on behalf of mankind. Odysseus was himself a kind of trickster. The Trojan horse was his idea, and he tricked his way through all kinds of scrapes as he made his way home. Shakespeare's Puck was a trickster, as was Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner. Herman Melville wrote a classic trickster comes to town story in his novel, The Confidence Man, which tells the story of a stranger who sneaks on board a Mississippi steamboat on April Fool's Day and attempts to earn the confidence of various passengers and the readers as well. April Fool's Day will show up again as we keep talking. So I have kind of a questions are pen names are nom de plume or pseudonym hoaxes meant to mislead us or just to protect the author's anonymity or gender. So for most of you, you know that Alice Mary Norton actually wrote under the name Andre Norton. Mary Ann Evans was George Eliot. George Sand was Also, these women who couldn't get published literally and had to write under a pseudonym. The Bronte sisters' names, the Bronte, were actually Kerr, Acton, and Ellis Bell. And J.K. Rowling, Joanne, J.K., she wanted to hide that she was the woman, has also written 3 books under the pen name of Robert Galbraith. Now, of course, we have Samuel Clemens. He repeatedly claimed that his nom de plume, or pen name Mark Twain, came from his time on the river. Mark Twain is a river term which measures 2 fathoms, which is 12 feet deep in depth, and mark, which is measured. Could I ask everyone to please turn off your sound? Thank you. Others suggest that he took the name from a riverboat captain that he had worked with on the Mississippi. However, according to Virginia City legend, he actually acquired the name long before it appeared in print, derived from his habit of striding into the old corner saloon and calling out to the barkeep, "Mark Twain," a phrase that Mississippi River boatmen sing out with their craft, but that in Virginia City specifically meant bring 2 blasts of whiskey to Sam Clemens and make 2 chalk marks against his account on the back wall of the saloon. Now, that might be an apocryphal story or it might be true. He was also known for his hoaxes or less than true articles. And the following news report appeared in the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada City's leading newspaper, on October 4th, 1862. And I will read this out to you. A petrified man was found some time ago in the mountains south of Gravelly Ford. Every limb and feature of the stony mummy was perfect, not even excepting the left leg, which has evidently been a wooden one during the lifetime of the owner, which lifetime, by the way, came to a close about a century ago. The body was in a sitting posture and leaning against a huge mass of croppings. The attitude was pensive, the right thumb resting against the side of the nose. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to go to the end. Everyone goes to see the stone man. As many as 300 have visited the hardened creature during the past 5 or 6 weeks. And this is from the book that he actually published later. What the story did was it really mocked a gullible public who were just too quick to accept a mass of petrification reports. They were all over newspapers and magazines at the time. The humorous story was, and again, if people could please mute themselves, the humorous story was quickly picked up by other newspapers and spread east. It became the seed from which the literary career, his career really subsequently blossomed, even though it was published anonymously. And it was 4 months before he started using his name as nom de plume, Mark Twain, although that wasn't the only use of a pen name. And I could talk for forever on him, so I'm not going to talk about all those. He really did use it for self-promotion. And in his 1968 letter from Washington, he extols the really casual, free atmosphere of territorial journalism, where news was routinely invented and unencumbered by considerations of accuracy or fact. And if that reminds you of today, it does. In December 1794, William Ireland told his father, a rare book dealer, that he had discovered a cache of old documents belonging to an acquaintance who wanted to remain unnamed, and that one of them was a deed with the signature of Shakespeare on it. He gave the document to his overjoyed father to sell. He first forged a letter that he claimed was written by Shakespeare, expressing gratitude towards the Earl of Southampton for his patronage. He went on to make more findings, a promissory note, a written declaration of Protestant faith, letters to Anne Hathaway with the lock of her hair attached, and to Queen Elizabeth, all supposedly in Shakespeare's hand. He claimed that all of them came from the chest of this anonymous friend. And he also found books with Shakespeare's notes in the margins and original manuscripts for Hamlet and King Lear. The experts of the day authenticated them all, as well as other forgeries of other famous people. And these are some of the forgeries. On the 24th of December, 1795, he published his own book about the papers, which was a lavishly illustrated and expensively produced set of facsimiles and transcriptions of the papers called Miscellaneous Papers and Legal Instruments under the Hand and Seal of William Shakespeare. More people took interest in the matter, and the plot really began to unravel. It took a literary expert named Edmund Malone to publish an essay proving that all of Ireland's discoveries were actually fakes. And Ireland eventually confessed to everything after attempting to stage a lost Shakespeare play, which was panned by the press and by the people who came. The only person who refused to believe him was his father. He insisted that the works were real. He went around telling everyone that his son couldn't have forged the works by Shakespeare because he was too stupid to have done so. And he wasn't the only one to, the only hoaxer in the 18th century. In 1760, a professor named James Macpherson of the University of Edinburgh claimed he had gathered fragments of poetry dating back to the 3rd century, providing evidence that a Gaelic epic tradition had existed and rivaled the epics of ancient Greece. The best of all of those poets was someone named Ossian, who was kind of a Celtic Homer. It has been described as the greatest ever literary hoax, taking in world leaders from Napoleon to Thomas Jefferson and inspiring the likes of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Bryan to create the romantic movement of the late 18th century based on those themes and patterns. And you can see here that a quote from Thomas Jefferson directly. Samuel Johnson actually read the poems and wasn't impressed, but his pal Boswell loved Ossian and even raised money to help the author conduct further research. Macpherson produced some originals, but it was clear that these were works that he himself had written in English and had clumsily translated back to Gaelic. And there was a young man by the name of Thomas Chatterton. He was steeped in Chaucer and fascinated by England's medieval past. He invented an alter ego named Thomas Rowley, who was a 15th century monk who also wrote poems as real, claiming that he found them in the bedroom or the back room of his uncle's church. He was caught and eventually committed suicide. In 1835, the New York Sun, and this was a paper that I could also talk about Mark Twain faking some articles under pseudonyms, published an article in which it was claimed that an astronomer named John Herschel had invented a new and really powerful telescope, which he immediately pointed at the moon, of course, only to find that the moon was inhabited by humanoid creatures with wings flying up around on the moon. The humanoid creature was a hoax, but the telescope was not. And this is a picture of it. Edgar Allan Poe was really angry because he believed that the report published by the Sun had plagiarized one of his own short stories. He held a grudge for years until he finally got his revenge against the Sun by tricking them into publishing an account of the explorer Monk Mason, whom he claimed crossed the Atlantic by balloon for the first time. Now, this wasn't Poe's first hoax. In fact, he's known for his hoaxes. There's at least 6 or 7 credited to him. There is a story that in late March.
You know, there's his house or museum in, I think, Richmond.
I want to go.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you, whoever just added that. So
Sorry.
That's fine. The story goes in late March of 1829 or 1831. He placed a notice in a local Baltimore paper announcing that on the morning of April 1st, a man would leap off the top of the recently built Phoenix Shot Tower and by means of his newly invented flying machine fly to Lazaretto Point Lighthouse, which was a distance of 2.5 miles. And this is the lighthouse. That is Shot Tower. At the time, it was the tallest structure in the United States, standing 234 feet high. Naturally, the idea of a man flying from the top of the tower generated enormous excitement. So a large crowd gathered to see the spectacle. However, no aeronaut ever appeared, causing the crowd to grow upset and unruly until they realized that it was April Fool's Day and dispersed. Poe reportedly published a card of regret in that afternoon's paper, explaining that the aeronaut had been unable to keep his engagement because one of his wings had gotten wet. The problem is that that story might also be a hoax, as no record of it remains in papers from that period, and that the tale bears some similarity to a flying machine hoax that happened in Pittsburgh years earlier in 1846. The Pittsburgh hoax involved a notice that in the Pittsburgh Dispatch announcing that the inventor of a pair of wings would give a demonstration of a device by leaping from the top of the Holland Street Bridge, flying over the Allegheny River, and then returning to the place from which he'd started. A large crowd there gathered, and at the appointed hour, a mysterious man appeared, walked to the center of the bridge, and with a flourish released a goose from a cloth bag. The goose flew honking up into the air. And we also have the story, and I'm sorry for not being chronological. In 1371, Sir John Manville wrote a travel book that was hugely popular. It was about an English knight who left England around 1322 and went to Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Persia, and Turkey. The fascinated public really gobbled up these stories of islands where creatures had bodies of humans and heads like dogs, or people with mouths that were so small they had to suck all their food through reeds. By the way, that first time that a straw was ever used in a book. And a tribe of people who didn't eat or drink anything at all, managing to survive slowly through nourishment received from the smell of apples. And somehow I have, let me just go back. I might have, thank you. I went one slide too fast. In a story that could be in the right-wing media today, and when we go to open this up for conversation later, tell me if it rings true to you of what's happening today. There was a woman by the name of Maria Monks. She wrote about all kinds of illicit activity happening at a convent in Montreal. Priests and nuns were supposedly traveling back and forth through a secret tunnel, having sex and having babies. The babies would then be baptized, then strangled and dumped in a lime pit in the basement of the convent. Maria Monk said she was herself a nun for several years, but couldn't bear the idea of losing her child. So after becoming impregnated by a priest, she fled to safety. Protestants in New York and Montreal really demanded an investigation. A newspaper editor found some flaws in her story, but wasn't permitted to see the nun's room or the basement. So he returned and declared that the investigation was unfinished. But that really created a stir. So he was invited back and permitted to see the entire convent a second time. He concluded that it was unlikely that she had ever been to the convent because her description of it, of the interior, was so inaccurate. It turns out that it was false. She was a prostitute in Montreal who had spent years in an asylum for wayward girls, but her book remained in print well into the 20th century. I'm afraid that I don't have access to the chat. Are there any questions up to, and Winslow, I do talk about JFK's profiles in Courage at the end of the talk. So hold on for that. And Robert Drury published his journal in 1729, 40 years earlier. He'd been shipwrecked off the coast of Madagascar. His shipmates were all slaughtered, supposedly, but he himself was enslaved by the islanders, fighting in local wars and getting married before finally escaping on a slave ship and heading back to England. Everyone believed that this was true throughout the 18th century. It was not just an adventure story, but kind of an adventure book, a resource for details on Madagascar, and was used as such for 100 years. The account came into question and rumor grew that Robert Drury did not exist, and his journal had been written by Daniel Defoe, whose picture you see here, who later became famous for the novel Robinson Crusoe. In the 20th century, an archaeologist re-examined Drury's book and compared it with what was known of Madagascar at the time and declared that it was far too accurate for Defoe to have invented it. It was either a story that Defoe had heard from someone else or an example of a factual narrative that was mistaken for a hoax. I do want to talk just a little bit about slave narratives. This is something that could also totally have its own hour or so. But because slaves were largely but completely barred from literacy, demand for their writing was really strong, especially after the before and after the Civil War, and especially among abolitionists. One of the people who spent a lot of time looking at that is Henry Louis Gates Jr. He explains that two forms of imitators soon arose. There were white writers adopting a first-person Black narrative persona, which really gave birth to the narrative, and Black authors, some of them who had never been to the South, a plantation or a whipping post, but became literary lions virtually overnight. Narratives by Olaudah Equiano, I hope I have that right, Frederick Douglass, and countless others insisted in their titles that they were written by himself, showing the importance of both literacy and authenticity. And that is true to a point, but both had, in this instance, both had extensive help from white abolitionist editors who really helped shape the narratives to make them more compelling and readable. And going back to the early work by Olaudah Equiano, he wrote in 1789 an autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. And this is really an excellent example. The book went through 9 editions in his lifetime. By 1792, it was a bestseller and had been published in Russia, Germany, Holland, and the US. It was really the first influential slave narrative of what later became a large literary genre. Equiano says he was born in 1745 in a charming fruitville named Asaka in an Igbo-speaking region on the west coast of Africa in what is now southeastern Nigeria. He was enslaved and taken to America. And to quote from the book, the closeness of the place and in the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. The wretched scene was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. In researching his life, Vincent Coretta, a professor of English editing a new version of the memoir, found that 2 records led him to question the former slave's account of being born in Africa. And in his 2005 biography suggested that Equiano may have been born in South Carolina rather than Africa. Additional scholarship has shown that that has been true. And I'm going to just go back to the chat. So Stephen said there's a book where the author retraces some of his steps around 10 Middle East. So it seems that some of his stories are actually based on experience, but the book has a lot of other plagiarism. And he goes on to say the book was Milton Giles, The Riddle and the Night in Search of John Manville. So thank you for adding that. And whoops, I am now having trouble. There we go. Henry Louis Gates also cites the examples of Archie Moore, the slave, 1836, who was in actuality a white historian by the name of Richard Hildreth, and the autobiography of a female slave written by Mattie Griffith, a white woman who owned slaves at the time of her imposture. And to counteract the bad press of these false accounts, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is a legitimate 1845 memoir and treatise on abolition written by the famous orator and former slave. In factual detail, the text really describes events of his life and is considered one of the most influential pieces of literature to fuel the US abolitionist movement of the early 19th century. It contains two introductions by really two well-known white abolitionists, a preface by William Lloyd Garrison and a letter by Wendell Phillips, both arguing for the veracity of the account and the literacy of the author. And I might make a side note that a relative of mine, a great uncle, actually helped to support the reissue of some of his books and traveled with Frederick Douglass across the country years later as he grew older. I'm now going to go into some of the more current ones, and these are all things that you probably are really well aware of. You might have read them thinking that they were true and they were not. The first is James Frey, A Million Little Pieces. When it was first published, it was categorized as a memoir of his struggles with drug addiction and his experiences in rehab. He would have gotten away with it too if it not for Oprah Winfrey, who selected it as one of her book club editions, and it became a subject of national attention. It was pretty easy to unravel his web of lies. While he was certainly a recovering addict who'd been in rehab, most of the novels, and you'll notice that saying novels now, memorable events never happened. This is the reissue of it, even though it's calling it a memoir. The publisher did have to later admit that it was a novel and change all of the book covers. And I don't know if you guys remember Carlos Castaneda. He claimed his book was an academic record of his experiences learning the secrets of the universe from a Yaqui Indian mystic. He was studying for his master's in anthropology and submitted the report as his thesis, complete with detailed notes on his meetings with this mystic that he called Don Juan. The late 1960s was really an ideal time to put some academic polish on the idea that peyote would free your mind and show you truth. And a legion of hippie wannabes bought the book and believed it. I didn't do drugs, but I certainly bought the book. And while he never admitted to the fraud, a careful study of his records and notes made it clear that he made everything up. And I don't know if anybody has read anything by J.T. Leroy. Every book and essay that J.T. Leroy created is actually, I would call, a hoax. In 1996, there was an essay appeared in the anthology Close to the Bone, Memoirs of Hurt, Rage, and Desire by J.T. Leroy. He was supposedly a 16-year-old boy from Appalachia who had already lived a whole sordid lifetime. Drug use, prostitution, and sleeping on the streets. Transgender, by the way. Other essays were soon published, and at 17, he received a contract for a novel that would be published as Sarah in 2000. People started clamoring to get JT on their television shows and on their angles, to interview him for newspapers. The problem was that JT Leroy did not exist, and that the author was, in reality, a woman from Brooklyn by the name of Laura Albert. To perpetuate the ruse, her sister-in-law, who was an actress, posed to do interviews as Laura Albert claims that it was not a hoax and that her intention was not to deceive. However, it was filed under nonfiction when you purchase the book in any bookstore. And that's how it still is today. I don't know if anybody has seen the movie or if this is a movie that is still just kind of coming out. Go Ask Alice by Anonymous. A lot of these books actually are about drugs, which I thought was interesting. Go Ask Alice is a book about a troubled drug addicted teen. She was a 15-year-old girl who got dosed with LSD at a party and decided she liked drugs. It's presented as a personal diary of an anonymous girl, but in reality, it was a youth counselor by the name of Beatrice Sparks who acquired, and supposedly this woman acquired it and edited it just lightly for publication. It's a tragedy at the end, of course, as the girl actually spirals into addiction, spends time in an asylum, and dies a few years later. And later, Beatrice Sparks admitted that she wrote a number of fake diaries, but Go Ask Alice is the most famous of them. Love and Consequences by Margaret B. Jones was a supposed memoir of a half-white, half-Native American girl growing up in Los Angeles as a foster child among gangbangers. Much of the book was about running drugs for the Bloods, but the author of the memoir, Margaret B. Jones, did not exist. She was the invention of Margaret Seltzer, who is white from the San Fernando Valley, a private school graduate who had never lived with a foster family. And when confronted about the lies, said that she based her book on friends she had met while working on the problem of gang violence. Her publisher ended up having to recall all copies of the book. I am lucky to still have one. When we do the conversation, I'd love to talk about this kind of cultural misappropriation because it happens a lot with white authors writing as somebody from an ethnic group. This is Coffee, Tea, or Me by Donald Bain. He wrote this in 1966. He was hired supposedly to interview a pair of stewardesses about, well, he was actually hired to interview these stewardesses about helping them write a memoir of their experiences, but he was disappointed to find that they didn't have enough interesting material for a book. So he fabricated the stories of these two women as really sexually liberated stewardesses who described the then glamorous experience of commercial flight in real detail. Not to mention their love affairs and other provocative adventures. The amazing thing is these two original stewardesses loved being in on the joke and cheerfully did press for it, even though it was all made up. He ended up writing 3 sequels and made a lot of money off of the hoax. The one that bothered me the most, because this is one of my favorite books, the 1965 novel, The Painted Bird, wasn't presented to the world as a memoir, but author Jerzy Kosinski allowed everyone to assume that it was inspired by his own tragic experiences in Eastern Europe during World War II. The story is told from the experiences of an orphaned Jewish boy who undergoes a series of terrible, violent events as he struggles to stay out of the clutch of the Nazis. The revelation that Kosinski actually plagiarized the work of several Polish authors whose books weren't well known in the English-speaking world turned what was really a heartbreaking work and a powerful emotional work into a book that was dismissed, or in today's parlance, Kosinski is canceled. And I don't have a slide for it of him, but I don't know if everybody remembers Jean Shepherd, one of my favorite writers. Most of us, he was a radio personality in the 1950s, and I think he perpetuated one of the best hoaxes of all times. He was the author narrator of the Christmas classic, A Christmas Story. Most of us saw that and remembered the BB gun story. He was really annoyed at the way bestseller lists were compiled in the mid-1950s, different from now. They were determined from sales figures, not just sales figures, but for the number of requests for new and upcoming books at bookstores. So he urged his listeners to enter bookstores and ask for a non-existent book. He fabricated the author, Frederick R. Ewing, and concocted a title, I Libertine, and outlined a basic plot for his listeners to use on bookstore clerks. Fans of the show took it even further, planning references to the books and authors so widely. Demand for the book led to its inclusion on the New York Times best-selling list, for which they later changed their formula. So bookstores really became interested in carrying his novel. The author, who is Ian Ballantine, got together with novelist Theodore Sturgeon and Shepherd for lunch. They ended up hiring Sturgeon to write the novel based on Shepherd's outline. Betty Ballantine, the wife, completed the final chapter after Sturgeon fell asleep exhausted on the Ballantine's couch, having tried to meet the deadline in one marathon typing session. And I love this cover, turbulent, turgist, tempestuous. It uses tubular tumescence in this book, quite wonderful. So they finally published I, Libertine simultaneously in hardcover and paperback editions, with Gene Shepherd actually pictured as the author Ewing. They had him looking really just, crazed as possible on the back cover is photograph. The proceeds of that book was donated to charity. And a few weeks after the publication, the Wall Street Journal officially exposed the hoax, although it really was just an open secret. A novel by Danny Santiago. This was a 1983 book about Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and was judged by the Times Book Review to be an honest, steady novel that presents some hard cultural realities. The name of the jacket, as you'll see, is Danny Santiago, and it lent it authenticity, even though there was no accompanying author photo. It turns out that there was a reason for this. It was actually written by Daniel Lewis James, who was the son of a wealthy Kansas businessman who attended Andover and Yale, where he majored in classical Greek. He based the novel on his experiences working as a volunteer in poor neighborhoods in LA. The revelation of his pseudonym after the book was published caused a backlash to his bewilderment. Friends had really warned him about using a Latino name, but what he said was, I thought the pen name was pretty well established. Mark Twain does it, Rabelais does it, and so many others. I said, nobody's going to be hurt if the book's any good. Well, again, the book was hurt and has been pulled by the publisher. In the late 1960s, with books by Harold Robbins and Jacqueline Suzanne topping the bestseller list, the Newsday columnist Mike McGrady decided that any novel with explicit sex in it could sell. So he rallied 24 of his fellow male journalists at the paper, and they wrote a hoax novel satirizing the genre. The group used up the made-up name Penelope Ashe, and his sister played the role of Ashe in meetings with the publishers. The book sold 20,000 copies when it was first published in early 1969. Then McGrady and his crew went on the David Frost show to reveal themselves. And after being introduced as Penelope Ashe, they walked onto the stage one by one as the house band played the song, "A Pretty Girl is Like a Melody." You can actually still see that tape on YouTube. And this is one of the last of the they still go on all the time. There was a book that came out called The Cuckoo's Calling. It's a gritty old crime novel by a first-time author, Robert Galbraith. It only sold 1,000 copies when it was published, but it gained tremendous critical acclaim that didn't help sales at all. Regardless, there were no requests for authors' interviews or for promotion. Robert Galbraith was apparently a former military police investigator. The publisher decided that profits were more important than critical acclaim, as did the real author, and unveiled the hoax that J.K. Rowling had authored the books. Sales skyrocketed within a month, or I'm sorry, in a week, to 500,000 copies. Robert Galbraith has written 3 more books, by the way, in the series. So they've continued the hoax. I don't know, I haven't seen the backs of the book, so I don't know if she credits it. This was the biggest heartbreak for me because this was possibly my favorite book and the book that I wanted to emulate when I wanted to become a travel and food writer, and that's Travels with Charlie in Search of America by John Steinbeck. There are countless others that we could talk about as well. But what he did was recount a story about me and my dog road book, and but later they came to the conclusion that the nonfiction book was really totally fiction, and he made it all up. He never did those travels, certainly not with his dog. And it was uncovered by a writer by the name of Bill Steigerwald. There are other Holocaust books. This is Misha De Fonseca's extraordinary story was published almost 20 years ago or more as Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years. The book describes how when she was 6, her Jewish parents, were taken from their home by the Nazis. She set off across Belgium, Germany, and Poland to find them on foot, living on stolen scraps of food until she was adopted by a pack of wolves. She also claimed to have shot a Nazi soldier in self-defense. This story was a huge bestseller and was made into a film in France, but in 2008, it was found to be fabricated. The real author is Monique DeVal, explained that it's not the true reality, but it is my reality. And there are times when I find it difficult to differentiate between reality and my inner world. So she never copped to it. And we finally get to what was one of my favorite all-time books, and Profiles in Courage. So The Songline is a 1987 book written by Bruce Chatwin, the travel writer. It was promoted originally as nonfiction. He describes a trip to Australia, which he took for the express purposes of researching Aboriginal songs and its connection to nomadic travel. Discussions with Australians, many of them Indigenous Australians, yielded insight into outback culture, Aboriginal culture, and religion, and the Aboriginal lands right movement. This book really contributed to that movement, by the way, to give some parity and some recompense to a lot of their Aboriginal people. Later, they had to reclassify the book as fiction. In reality, it was always a blend of both, and Chatwin had pitched it that way to his publisher. It would take another session to really discuss all the books that have been ghostwritten or told to another writer. As I said before, I've been a ghostwriter signing non-disclosure statements, legally binding me to never reveal my authorship. Luckily, one of my authors is dead, and I feel like I might tell people soon. I'll end this talk with 2 more. One is Profiles in Courage by John Fitzgerald Kennedy. That question came up earlier. The idea for the book came to Kennedy in 1954 when he was a first-time senator. Initially, he imagined it as a magazine article, but during a long convalescence after a couple of back operations, he decided to make it into his book. His chief assistant on the project was his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen. Kennedy did conceive the book and supervised its production, but did little of the research and writing. There's some supposition that he did none of the research and very, very little of the writing, although he did edit it. Although it was more of as a told to. So the recuperating Kennedy did send Sorensen a stream of notes and dictation, requested books, asked that memos be prepared and so on. It was really Sorensen who worked virtually full-time on the project for 6 months, sometimes 12 hours a day. He coordinated the work and drafted many of the chapters, but others also made contributions, most importantly, Georgetown University history professor Jules David. Yes, Jules Davids. And I'm going to end with Alex Haley wrote the book Roots. I have quite a wonderful story about bringing Alex Haley to Sac State, by the way. His Kunta Kinte, his character, was based on one of his ancestors, a Gambian man who was born in 1750, enslaved and taken to America, and who died in 1822. The problem is that character did not exist. A local man that he paid to help do research just created the character based on what Haley told him. And though Haley said that his account of Kunta's life in Roots is a mixture of fact and fiction, and the book was sold as a novel, and it was sold as a novel, it was promoted as nonfiction in bookstores and in most of Haley's appearances. And a lot of these hoaxes are always in the nonfiction side of the bookstores. So that is, I want to ask you guys to join us. I'm going to stop the share in just a second. I have to say, I'd like to thank all of the ethicists and journalists whose work I so liberally plagiarized from today. I do have my notes and I have it fully documented, but it's too hard to stop each time and to thank somebody. I also want to credit my father, Harry Keith Burns Sr., one of the greatest but benign con men of all time. He made antiques for a living, as I've told other people. And yes, the name is fake. And my brother, Keith Burns, Harry Keith Burns, I didn't know his first name was Harry until last year, who once signed one of his books to Andy Warhol, Best Keith, as a joke for a friend, not realizing that the friend was going to turn around and sold it almost immediately for $600. I've wanted to see if it comes up for auction yet again. And also to Charlotte Madden, who is our grandfather, and whose life is a total mystery. And all the stories we heard of him was that my father was following in that con man tradition. So I'm now going to open it up. I know that Anna has her hand up, and I'm going to see now if I can. And hopefully I'm just going to have to ask you to unmute on your own. I'm still not able to.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
great, good.
Well, I was disappointed to hear. I loved Songlines, that book by Chatwin. I really loved it and I believed it.
Yeah, hold
And
on. My brother's coming in. Bye, Keith. Anyway, go on.
how much of that is true? Because I
You know,
loved that book.
Yeah, that I have to tell you, that book actually was the reason that I wanted to become a writer. I actually did programs on the songlines. I pitched children's stories based on his book. It is, a lot of it is composite characters, meaning that he did hundreds and hundreds of interviews, but it was easier sometimes in a book like that to take all of the stories and put it into the guise of one person, rather than the 12 or 13 people that tell you the story. So I think that it's mostly true.
Good.
Right? But it's an amalgamation. And you see it all the time when you see a movie that says based on a book or based on a true story. They fictionalized it. Some of it is, most of his thing was chronological in terms of things occurred one time that actually occurred at another time.
Okay.
Great. And let me
Thanks.
just. Okay. Oh, is the guy sitting on the back seat chanting out the sign lines at top speed purely fictional? No, I don't know if people know about the song lines, but what I love about the Aboriginal stories, and they have lots, they do not have tricksters, by the way. It's one of the few cultures that don't. Every item, whether it's a leaf or a rock or a mountain or an animal, would not exist if a person who's currently living doesn't live to tell their story. And it's just wonderful. It's why storytelling is just so important to me, and why I'm encouraging you to add your story. So if you don't have any questions, if any of you know of other literary hoaxes that you'd like to talk about or that you remember, now's the time to bring them up. There must be more. Anyone? No? Oh, so the question is from Steve, did Kerouac really write his writing on the road in one go? What do you think the answer to that is, Stephen? The answer is no. What he did do was to write it in one continuous roll. A lot of stories, the Merry Pranksters, actually, he did a lot of fudging stories and co-opting the stories of other people that people told him, and also told it as truth himself. But it is a fallacy that he wrote it all at one time. And next semester, or rather in the fall, because I'm taking off a lot next semester, I'm hoping to tell the story of Victor Wong along with his stepson, Dutch Falcone. Victor Wong was an incredible poet here in Sacramento. He was a beat poet that used to hang around with Kerouac early on. He was a KQED journalist who became an actor. He was in Wong is Missing, The Great Emperor, and a tremendous storyteller and photographer. So he left a lot of beat papers, and I was able to interview him about some of those stories, so I hope to repeat it. Sharon, you have your hand up.
I did. So one of the hoaxes that I fell for was a book called 3 Cups of Tea that was supposedly about a guy that was in, he was mountain climbing in like Tibet or something, and he got lost, and this village picked him up, and I actually sent him money because he then formed a charitable organization where he was supposedly building schools for girls and predominantly Middle Eastern countries. And I later heard that the whole thing was made up and there were no schools and he didn't make, and there was no village. And I was like, oh no.
No, so the worst part of that story, by the way, is that almost every town in America selected it as its one book, where everybody in the nation read that book at once. I was involved at the Sacramento Public Library that brought him to town, and I'm sure we paid him $10,000 to come, although, and I think he got that money directly. I hope I'm not, if Rivka Sass is here, she could, possibly correct it. But you are so right. There are so many things like that. That was another heartbreak. And, James Frey, who did the first one, took him about a year and then was able to recover later. There are reporters that have been fired from the New York Times for just faking stories. And in Sacramento, maybe somebody can remember her name, we had a tremendous columnist at the Sacramento Bee who I loved, and I'm sorry for blanking on her name, who they had to let go because they found out that she had faked all of her columns. And then Stephen again, the Adolf Hitler diaries. Steve, do you have access to where you could actually talk about that? Because I meant to go do some research on it and forgot it. Is there anything you can add on that? No. Oh, he just remembered it from the news. And I will pick that up. I might do it from the news. I might mention, and again, I hope we get some more conversation, although I'll close up early if we have to. I have myself wanted to write a book on my father, along with my 2 brothers. And the title of it, we've already come up with the title, is the Autobiography of a Nobody. And the reason, but we wanted to write it in his voice because we're going just off of the stories that we thought he told us, or that others told us, because he only left, even though he was a writer, he only left 5 pages of writings that we've been able to keep from him. And all the rest of them are just stories that we've heard or that are augmented by other people who would tell stories about him. So the question becomes, if we do write that book, do we do it as told to his 3 children? How do you be careful that you're not perpetrating a fraud, but telling a really comparing a story? Stephen again says there was another supposed Australian Aboriginal elder who wrote a book called Us Folks, I think, which later turned out to be a white writer. Yes, how true. Good. So anyone else want to add anything, or we'll close up early because there's so much to do on a Friday? Last chance. All right, I want to thank everyone. What I'm going to do is to stop the recording and then just stick around for about 5 more minutes for people that they want to just share and get to know each other. Next week, there is a program in the evening, October 22nd. I'll make sure everybody gets the right link to that one with Carol Stivers, who is an author who's written a new book. We normally don't do Friday night programs, but It was the only time that she was available. And then Angie Rooney is going to be doing a great talk on genealogy on her search for her family on October 29th at 10 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone, kind of, and then I'll be right back.